Every morning, the sun returns to find the forest just as it was, untouched.
My name is Russlin. I'm nearly 60 now, and I've spent the last several decades in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn. These days, my life is simple, almost painfully so. I drive a cab. I drive it all day, every day, until the streets blur together and the radio becomes background noise. Your podcast keeps me company during those long hours behind the wheel. But this wasn't always my life. I came to the United States in 1992, not long after my homeland vanished in the quietest, most unreal way imaginable. One morning, the Soviet Union simply ceased to exist. With it went everything. I had built my identity around my military rank, the pension I'd earned, the certainty that I belonged somewhere in the world. It all dissolved overnight. I didn't come to America chasing ambition or prosperity. I wasn't searching for freedom or opportunity. I came because I was tired. I came because I wanted something the old world could no longer give me. I didn't want the noise of the city back then. I wanted to disappear into the vastness of the American wilderness. That's how I ended up working as a backcountry ranger in the Gifford Pinchot National Forest in Washington State. It's a place of ancient, suffocating greenery. If you've never been there, you can't understand how deep the silence goes. It's not a peaceful silence. It's a heavy, waiting silence. In the summer of 1998, I was stationed at a remote outpost near the base of what the locals called Devil's Peak. It wasn't a popular tourist spot. The terrain was too jagged, the trails too overgrown. My job was simple: trail maintenance, fire watch, and making sure the few off-grid hikers didn't get themselves killed. I worked with two other men. There was Diego, a senior ranger who had been in the service since the 72nd. He was a skeptic to his core, a man of dirt, granite, and logic. If a tree fell and no one heard it, Diego would say it's because trees are heavy and gravity exists. Then there was Miller, a kid barely 23 who had watched too many movies. He was the overreactor. Every snapped twig was a Sasquatch. Every missing hiker was a government conspiracy. I was the bridge between them. The calm thinker tempered by a life where I'd seen real regimes fall. I knew that the scariest thing in the world wasn't a monster. It was a human being with a purpose you didn't understand. The trouble started on a Tuesday. I was patrolling a section of the old Go Trail, a path that had been officially closed since the 82nds due to washouts. About 4 miles in, I found something that didn't belong. In the middle of the trail, where the mud was thick and gray, sat a pair of shoes. They were expensive leather dress shoes, polished to a high shine. They weren't tossed there. They were placed side by side, perfectly parallel, pointing toward the densest part of the brush. There were no footprints leading to them, and none leading away. I knelt down, the smell of damp pine and rot filling my nose. I radioed it in. "Sarah, you there?" I asked, my voice flat. Sarah was our dispatcher, a woman who had seen everything and stayed remarkably sane. "Go ahead, Russlin," her voice crackled through the static. "I've got a 10 to 54. Sort of. Abandoned property on Old Goat. One pair of men's dress shoes. Size 10, maybe. They look brand new." There was a pause. "Any sign of the owner?" "Negative. No tracks. It's like they were dropped from a plane, except they're sitting perfectly straight. Copy that. Bag them if you want, or leave them. Probably just kids messing around." I didn't bag them. A strange coldness settled in my stomach. I've seen odd things in the woods: shovels, old clothes, even a piano once, but those shoes looked expectant. I left them and continued my patrol. That night, back at the cabin, I told Diego and Miller about it. Diego scoffed, leaning back in his creaky wooden chair while cleaning his pipe. "Hipsters," he grunted. "They go out there to do art, or whatever they call it. Leave some shoes, take a photo, feel deep. Don't waste your breath, Russ." Miller, however, was already pacing. "No tracks, Russ. The mud is soft up there. If someone walked there, you'd see it. You said it yourself. It was like they were dropped. But they were straight. That's a ritual, man. That's an invitation. An invitation to what, Miller?" I asked, lighting a cigarette. "To follow," he whispered. I told him to shut up and go to sleep. But that night I couldn't. The cabin felt thin. The walls of cedar felt like paper against the weight of the forest outside. Around 3:00 a.m., I heard it. A whistle. It wasn't a bird, and it wasn't the wind. It was a human whistle, 3 notes rising in pitch, then cutting off sharply. It was the exact whistle we used to signal each other during search and rescue. I looked over at Diego's bunk. He was snoring. Miller's bunk was empty. My heart hammered against my ribs. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The air was freezing. I panned the light across the tree line. The beams caught the eyes of a deer, two emerald glints that vanished instantly. "Miller," I called out softly. "Over here," a voice whispered from the darkness to my left. Miller was standing near the woodpile, his face pale in the moonlight. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking up at the ridge of Devil's Peak. "Did you hear that?" he asked. "The whistle, yeah." "Was that you?" "No," he said, his voice trembling. "It came from the ridge." "And Russ, look at the porch step." I lowered my flashlight. There on the bottom step of our cabin was a single leather dress shoe, the mate to the ones I'd seen 4 miles away on the old goat trail. It was pointing directly at the front door. The next morning, the atmosphere in the cabin was suffocating. Diego, seeing the shoe on the step, finally lost his smirk, though he refused to admit he was scared. He called it malicious trespassing. He figured some local survivalist was playing a psychological game with us, trying to run the feds off their mountain. "We're going up there," Diego declared, strapping on his sidearm. "We find whoever is doing this, we sight them, and we end the joke. Miller, stay by the radio. Russ, you're with me." We hiked for 3 hours toward the ridge where the whistle had come from. The forest changed as we climbed. The Douglas firs gave way to twisted, stunted hemlocks. The ground was covered in a thick carpet of moss that swallowed the sound of our boots. Diego was led moving with a grim determination. I followed my hand, instinctively hovering near my own holster. In the Soviet army, I had seen what men did when they thought no one was watching. I didn't fear ghosts. I feared the capacity for human cruelty. We reached a small clearing known as the Altar, a flat shelf of rock overlooking a deep ravine. Diego stopped dead. "Russ," he said, his voice losing its iron, "tell me I'm seeing things." I stepped up beside him. In the center of the rock shelf, someone had set a table. It wasn't a real table, but a flat slab of granite propped up by smaller stones. On top of it sat a pristine white tablecloth. There were 2 plates, 2 sets of silverware, and 2 wine glasses filled with a dark, viscous liquid. And in the center of the plates, raw hearts. They were small, probably from deer or elk, but they were fresh. They were still steaming in the cool mountain air. This is sick," Diego muttered. He pulled out his radio. "Miller, come in." Miller, static. Nothing but the sound of the void. "The range is clear. We should have a signal," I said, checking my own radio. Nothing. I looked around the clearing. The trees were dense, their branches interlacing like skeletal fingers. I felt that psychological weight again, the sensation of being watched by 100 eyes. It wasn't a monster feeling. It was the feeling of being a mouse in a glass box, and the person outside the box is just deciding which side to tap on. "We need to go back," I said. "We need to get Miller and get down to the ranger station in the valley. This isn't a prank, Diego. This is a hunt." Diego nodded, his face ashen. We turned to head back down the trail, but the forest seemed to have shifted. The trail we had just walked up was gone. Not washed out, not covered, just gone. In its place was a wall of impenetrable thorny brush that looked years old. "That's impossible," Diego whispered. "We were just here. We just walked this path." Then the whistle started again. It wasn't coming from the ridge anymore. It was coming from everywhere. It was a chorus of whistles, all using our search and rescue signal. 3 notes rising, then cutting off. But then they changed. They began to mimic our voices. "Russlin," a voice whispered from the trees to the left. It sounded exactly like Miller. "Russlin, I'm lost. Help me," Miller, Diego shouted, turning toward the sound. "Wait," I grabbed his arm. "Listen to the cadence. It's too perfect. It's a recording, or someone who has been practicing." "Diego, it's cold," the voice continued. Then it broke into a wet, guttural laugh. Suddenly, something heavy crashed through the brush to our right. We both drew our weapons. Out stumbled Miller. His uniform was torn and his eyes were wide with a primal, unhinged terror. But he wasn't running to us. He was running past us. "Don't look at them," Miller screamed, his voice cracking. "If you look at them, they think you've accepted what I yelled, catching him by the shoulders. Miller looked at me, and I will never forget the expression on his face. It wasn't just fear. It was a total collapse of the soul. He leaned in his breath, smelling like old copper. "They aren't wearing masks, Russ," he whispered. "They're wearing us." Before I could ask what he meant, Miller wrenched himself free and dived off the ledge of the altar, disappearing into the fog of the ravine. Diego and I froze. A moment later, from the brush, where Miller had emerged, 3 figures stepped out. They were tall, dressed in tattered ranger uniforms, our uniforms. One of them wore a name tag that read Russlin, but where their faces should have been, there was only smooth, pale skin. No eyes, no noses, no mouths. Just a flat, fleshy surface that began to ripple. Then the one wearing my name tag began to speak. It didn't have a mouth, but my own voice, my Russian-accented, weary voice poured out of its chest. "I immigrated to the United States in 1992, the creature said, a short while after my country disappeared overnight. I felt my knees buckle. It wasn't just imitating me. It was reciting my life. It was claiming my identity. Run, Diego whimpered. Russ, run. We bolted into the woods, abandoning the trail, abandoning logic. We ran until my lungs burned like charcoal. I lost track of Diego. I lost track of direction. All I could hear behind me was the sound of my own voice, miles away, still narrating my life to the empty trees. I eventually found a service road and flagged down a logging truck. I never went back to the outpost. I quit the service that day. Diego was found 3 days later. He was sitting in the middle of the old goat trail, perfectly still. He was uninjured, but he wouldn't speak. He just sat there, staring at his feet. He was barefoot. His shoes were gone. And me, I moved to Brooklyn. I drive a cab because the city is loud. I need the sirens, the shouting, the honking. I need the noise to drown out the memory of that silence. Because sometimes, when I'm driving late at night and the streets get quiet, I hear a whistle from the back seat. 3 notes, rising, then cutting off. And I know, they're still waiting for me to finish the meal. I've been told that memories are like ghosts. They only haunt you if you leave the door open. But in my line of work back then, the door was never really closed. After that business at Devil's Peak, I transferred. I told the Forest Service I needed a change of scenery, something less isolated, though. In the late 90 seconds, every national park felt like the edge of the world once the sun dipped below the tree line. I ended up in the North Cascades near the Canadian border. It's a landscape of jagged peaks and turquoise lakes that look like they were painted by someone who had never seen real water. It was 1995, and I was part of a search and rescue SAR team. The call came in at 4:15 p.m. on a Friday. A 6-year-old boy named Kevin had vanished from a picnic area near Blacktooth Basin. His parents had turned their backs for maybe 30 seconds to pack the cooler, and when they looked up, the boy was gone. No sound, no struggle, just an empty space where a child should have been. I was paired with Gabe, a veteran SAR leader who looked like he was carved out of cedar, and Chloe, a recruit who had just finished her training. Gabe was the skeptic. To him, every missing person was a mathematical equation of calories, terrain, and weather. Chloe was the overreactor. She had a habit of checking her GPS every 2 minutes and jumping at the sound of a falling pine cone. I was the one who just watched the ground. I knew that the earth always tells a story if you're patient enough to read it. He couldn't have gone far, Gabe said, adjusting his pack as we stepped onto the trailhead. A 6-year-old stride is short. He's likely within a 2-mile radius. Probably curled up under a log crying his eyes out. Unless something took him, Chloe whispered, her eyes darting toward the shadows beneath the hemlocks. Nothing takes people here, Chloe, Gabe snapped. They get lost, they get cold, and they make bad decisions. Keep your head in the game. We pushed deep into the basin as the light began to fail. The fog rolled in a thick, wet blanket that smelled of minerals and old snow. We reached an area called the Fingers, where the ground turns into a treacherous maze of waist-deep marshes and limestone outcrops. That's where we found the first sign. In the middle of a stagnant pool of water, sitting on a hummock of moss, was a plastic yellow dump truck. It was Kevin's. But it wasn't just sitting there. It was surrounded by a perfect circle of smooth white river stones. The stones were all roughly the same size, and they had been placed with surgical precision. What the hell? Gabe muttered, kneeling at the edge of the water. The river is half a mile away. A kid didn't carry these rocks here in 5 minutes. He didn't, I said, my voice low. And look at the mud, Gabe. I pointed my flashlight at the bank. There were no footprints. Not Kevin's, not an adult's. The moss around the stones was undisturbed. It was as if the entire display, the truck, and the stones had lowered from the sky. Maybe he was carried, Chloe suggested, her voice trembling. By a bird or a person. A person would leave tracks in this muck, I said. Even a light one. We continued the silence of the forest, feeling more like a deliberate wait. About an hour later, we found Kevin's jacket. It was a bright red windbreaker, easy to spot against the green. It was draped over a low-hanging branch. But it wasn't snagged. It was neatly folded, the sleeves tucked inward as if it had been placed there by a dry cleaner. Inside the pocket of the jacket was a handful of Berry's nightshade. Toxic, and they were crushed, turned into a paste that smeared against the lining. He's playing a game, Gabe said, though his voice lacked conviction. The kid is playing a game with us. Suddenly, a sound echoed through the basin. It was a laugh, high-pitched, melodic, and unmistakably a child's. It didn't sound scared. It sounded delighted. Kevin Chloe screamed, breaking protocol. Kevin, stay where you are. The laughter came again, this time from much higher up. We turned our lights toward the cliffs of Blacktooth. There, on a narrow ledge about 50 feet above the valley floor, was a small figure. It was Kevin. He was standing on a shelf of rock, barely wide enough for a mountain goat. He had no safety gear, no shoes. He was just standing there in his socks looking down at us. Jesus, Gabe breathed. How did he get up there? That's a Class 4 climb. I looked at the boy through my binoculars. He was smiling, but as the light hit his face, I realized his eyes weren't reflecting the beam. They were just dark pits. And he wasn't looking at us. He was looking at something behind us. He raised a hand and pointed. Behind you, the boy whispered. His voice didn't travel through the air. It felt like it vibrated inside my own skull. We all spun around our flashlights, cutting through the fog. There was nothing there but the trees. But when we turned back to the cliff, the ledge was empty. Kevin was gone. He fell. Chloe gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. He must have fallen into the crevice. We scrambled toward the base of the cliff, our hearts pounding. Gabe was already calling for helicopter extraction, though we knew the fog was too thick for anyone to fly. We reached the base of the rock wall, expecting to find a broken body, but there was nothing. No blood, no disturbed dirt. Just a single white river stone sitting at the base of the cliff. This is impossible, Gabe said, his skepticism finally cracking. He was right there. We all saw him. We saw something, I said. I looked up the cliffside. The rock was slick with moisture and moss. There were no handholds, no ledges leading up to where he had been standing. It was a sheer vertical drop. Even a professional climber would have needed a rope and pitons. Russ, look, Chloe whispered, pointing her light at a small opening in the rock, a chimney-like crack that disappeared into the mountain. Propped up against the entrance of the crack were Kevin's socks. They were soaked with blood. Gabe didn't hesitate. He was a rescue worker. His instinct to save overrode his fear. He squeezed into the crack, his headlamp flickering. Kevin, buddy, can you hear me? It's Ranger Gabe. I've got some crackers and water for you. I followed him, the cold stone pressing against my chest and back. The air inside the mountain smelled like wet earth and something else, something metallic and sharp. Chloe stayed at the entrance, her job to maintain radio contact, though we already knew the radios were dead. The crack opened into a small cavern. It was perfectly circular, the walls smooth, as if they had been polished by a river for 1,000 years. In the center of the room sat Kevin. He was sitting cross-legged, facing the wall. He was naked now, his small ribs visible as he breathed. He was holding something in his hands, a large, heavy river stone. He was rubbing it against the cave wall over and over with a rhythmic scritch, scritch, scritch. Kevin, Gabe said, softly, stepping forward. Hey, kiddo. Let's get you home. Your mom and dad are real worried. The boy didn't turn around. He didn't stop rubbing the stone. They aren't my parents, the boy said. His voice was different now. It was deeper sounding, like stones grinding together. They're just the ones who brought me to the gate. Okay, Kevin. Whoever they are, they want you back, Gabe said, reaching out to touch the boy's shoulder. "Gabe, wait," I said, a cold dread pooling in my gut. "Look at his hands." Gabe stopped. He lowered his flashlight. Kevin's fingers were gone. They hadn't been cut off. They had been worn down to the bone from rubbing the stone against the wall. There was no blood anymore, just raw white bone scraping against the granite. The boy slowly turned his head. It wasn't a natural movement. His neck twisted 180 degrees, his body remaining perfectly still, while his face turned to look at us. It wasn't Kevin. The face was a mask of wax melting. The eyes were holes that led into a hollow skull. "I'm not Kevin," it said, the boy's voice returning high and mocking. "I'm the weight." Suddenly, the cavern began to shake. Not an earthquake, but a localized vibration. The white stones we had seen earlier, the ones in the circle, the one at the cliff base, they began to roll into the room from the cracks in the ceiling. Dozens of them, hundreds of them, all clattering to the floor. "Out! Get out now!" I yelled, grabbing Gabe by the jacket and pulling him back toward the chimney. We scrambled through the narrow gap, the stones pelting our backs like hail. We burst out into the night air, gasping for breath. Chloe was gone. Her radio was lying on the ground, smashed. "Chloe!" Gabe screamed. We looked up at the cliff. There, on the same ledge where Kevin had stood, was Chloe. She was standing perfectly still, her eyes wide and glassy. She was holding a large river stone over her head with both hands. "Chloe, don't move," Gabe yelled. She didn't look at us. She looked up at the sky. "It's so light," she whispered. Her voice was crystal clear in the mountain air. I never knew it was this light. Then she stepped off. She didn't fall like a person. She didn't scream. She drifted down like a leaf, her body twisting in the air until she landed on the ground right in front of us. There was no sound of impact, no bone breaking. When we reached her, her clothes were empty. Her boots, her uniform, her gear, all laid out on the ground in the shape of a person. But Chloe was gone. In the center of her empty uniform sat a single white river stone. Gabe and I ran. We didn't stop until we reached the ranger station at dawn. The official report said Kevin was never found. It said Chloe was lost in a rock slide during the search. Gabe retired a month later. Last I heard, he moved to the desert somewhere where there are no trees and no stones. I stayed in the service for a few more years, but I never went back to the North Cascades. I moved to New York because here the ground is covered in concrete. It's heavy. It stays where you put it. But sometimes when I'm cleaning out my cab at the end of a shift, I find a small, smooth, white river stone under the passenger seat. I don't throw them away. I'm afraid that if I do, I'll become light, and I've seen what happens to people when they lose their weight. By the time 2003 rolled around, I thought I had seen the worst of what the American wilderness could hide. I had survived the shifting trails of the Cascades and the identity-stealing things in the Gifford Pinchot. I was older, my joints ached with the humidity, and I had transferred one last time to the Everglades in Florida. I wanted something flat. I was tired of climbing, tired of ridges, tired of the verticality of my fears. I thought if I could see for miles in every direction, nothing could surprise me. I was wrong. In the Everglades, the horror doesn't hide behind a tree. It hides just Dennisheath, the surface of the water, or right in front of your eyes, camouflaged by the sheer repetition of the sawgrass. I was stationed at a remote checkpoint in the Shark Valley district. My partners were Dennis and Frank. Dennis was a local, a man who had grown up in the swamps and treated alligators like stray dogs. He was the skeptic. He believed the only thing to fear in the glades was a cottonmouth or a lightning strike. Frank was the overreactor, a transfer from a city park in Chicago who jumped every time a bullfrog croaked. The summer of 2003 was one of the wettest on record. The river of grass was deep, and the heat was a physical weight that pressed the air out of your lungs. We were tasked with checking on a group of hydrologists who had set up a temporary research station deep in the 10,000 Islands area. They hadn't checked in via satellite phone for 48 hours. "It's the storm," Dennis said, spitting a glob of tobacco juice into the dark water as we prepped the airboat, fried their electronics. "We'll get out there, find them drinking beer and complaining about the mosquitoes, and be back by dinner." "They missed 2 check-ins, Dennis," Frank said, checking his sidearm nervously. "That's protocol. What if the boat flipped? What if they're stuck in the mangroves? Then they're wet." Dennis grunted. "Stop sweating, kid. You're attracting the bugs." We pushed off. The airboat's engine was a deafening roar, a mechanical scream that usually made me feel safe. It was too loud for anything other to exist. We skimmed over the water, the sawgrass parting like a green sea. But as we got deeper into the interior, the landscape started to feel wrong. The Everglades is a place of constant movement. Birds, fish, the wind and the grass. But 10 miles in, the life just stopped. I noticed it first, no herons taking flight, no gators sliding off the banks. Just a dead, stagnant stillness. We reached the coordinates for the research camp. It was a small hammock, a raised island of hardwood trees in the middle of the marsh. From a distance, it looked normal. I saw the silver glint of their equipment and the orange nylon of their tents. But as we pulled closer, the engine idling down to a low thrum, I felt a prickle of ice on the back of my neck. "Dennis," I whispered, "look at the tents." There were 3 tents. They were set up in a perfect line, exactly 4 feet apart. But they weren't just set up. They were staked directly into the mud at the water's edge, half submerged. The flaps were open, and the water was flowing freely through them. We docked the boat and stepped onto the muddy bank. The smell hit us immediately. It wasn't rot, it was the smell of ozone and bleach. "Where is all their gear?" Frank asked, his voice high and thin. The camp was empty. Not just of people, but of stuff. There were no sleeping bags, no stoves, no notebooks, just the tents. "Look at this," Dennis said, his skepticism finally wavering. He was pointing at a folding table in the center of the hammock. On the table sat 3 satellite phones. They were lined up perfectly, just like the tents. And next to them were 3 wedding rings. They hadn't been tossed there. They were placed in a neat row, largest to smallest. They wouldn't leave their rings, I said, my mind racing. Even if they were in a hurry, they wouldn't stop to line them up. Suddenly, Frank pointed toward the dense mangroves on the far side of the island. Is that one of them?" A figure was standing about 50 yards away, waist deep in the swamp water. It was a man in a khaki field shirt, one of the hydrologists. He was facing away from us, staring into the tangled roots of the mangroves. "Hey, Ranger Service," Dennis shouted, cupping his hands. "You okay?" The man didn't move. He didn't even flinch at the shout. "Maybe he's in shock," I said. "Dennis, stay here by the boat." Frank, with me. We waded into the water. The muck was thick, pulling at our boots like hands. As we got closer, I realized the man wasn't just standing there. He was vibrating. A low, rapid tremor was running through his entire body. Sir Frank reached out to touch the man's shoulder. The man spun around. It was Dr. Aris, the lead researcher. But his face, it looked like it had been erased. Not by violence, but by effort. His skin was pulled so tight over his skull that it was translucent. His eyes were wide, the pupils dilated, until there was no color left, and his mouth, it was sewn shut, not with thread, with his own hair. Long strands of his own scalp hair had been threaded through his lips, weaving them together in a crude, wet seal. He looked at us, and a sound came from behind the hair, a muffled, rhythmic clicking. "Oh God," Frank gagged, stumbling back. I grabbed Dr. Aris by the arms. "Doctor, what happened? Where are the others?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. He just raised a hand with fingernails that had been pulled out and pointed toward our airboat. I turned around. Dennis was still standing on the boat, but he wasn't looking at us. He was looking down into the water, and from the dark tea-colored depths of the swamp, dozens of pale, hairless heads were slowly breaking the surface around the boat. They had no faces, just smooth, wet skin, and those same sewn-shut mouths. "Dennis, get off the boat," I screamed. But Dennis was frozen. The man who feared nothing but lightning was staring into the blank face of a creature that had gripped the side of the airboat with long, spindly fingers. The creatures didn't move fast. They moved with a terrifying liquid grace. They began to climb onto the boat, their wet bodies making a sound like sliding meat. There were dozens of them. They weren't attacking. They were surrounding him, their heads tilting in unison like birds. Russ Dennis finally found his voice. "Russ, they're making me see it." "See?" What I yelled, struggling to pull Dr. Aris through the muck toward the island. "The bottom," Dennis shrieked. "The bottom of the world. It's empty, Russ. It's all empty." One of the creatures reached out and touched Dennis's face. It didn't claw him. It simply placed a palm over his mouth. And as it did, I saw something that still keeps me awake in my cab at 4:00 a.m. The creature's skin began to ripple. Dennis's features, his crooked nose, his weathered wrinkles, his graying beard began to appear on the creature's flat face. It was like a photograph developing on a blank sheet of paper. Dennis didn't fight. He began to go limp, his eyes glazing over as his very identity was vacuumed out of him. "Frank, fire," I ordered. Frank pulled his sidearm and began shooting. The cracks of the 9mm echoed across the marsh, but the bullets did nothing. They passed through the creatures, as if they were made of heavy smoke. They didn't bleed. They just paused the holes in their bodies, closing instantly with a wet pop. "We have to go." I grabbed Frank by the collar. "The boat is lost." Into the trees. We dragged Dr. Eris into the center of the hammock, into the densest part of the hardwood trees. We hid behind a massive banyan tree, its aerial roots providing a cage of sorts. The sound of the airboat's engine suddenly roared to life. I looked through the roots. The creatures were gone. Dennis was standing at the controls of the boat. He looked perfectly normal. He looked like the Dennis I had known for years. He turned the boat around and began to head back toward the main channel. Dennis Frank yelled about to run out. "Stay down," I hissed. "Look at his hands." Dennis was holding the steering stick, but his hands weren't hands anymore. They were long, translucent tentacles that had fused with the metal of the boat. And as the boat sped away, Dennis turned back and looked at us. He smiled. It was Dennis's smile. But he didn't use his voice. He used my voice. "Don't worry, Russlin," the thing that looked like Dennis shouted over the engine. "I'll tell them you stayed behind to help. I'll tell them you wanted to be part of the grass." We were left in the silence. Dr. Eris died an hour later, not from his wounds, but because his heart simply stopped beating. It was as if whatever had looked at him had taken the spark that kept his body running. Frank and I spent the night in that banyan tree. We didn't talk. We just listened to the clicking sound that filled the swamp. Thousands of those things hidden in the grass, communicating in a language of bone and water. We were found the next day by a rescue team. When they asked what happened, I told them the truth about the creatures, the faces, the theft of Dennis's soul. They didn't believe me, of course. They found the airboat abandoned 5 miles away. Dennis was never found. The official report stated that Dennis had suffered a psychotic break, murdered the researchers, and disappeared into the swamp. Frank was committed to a psychiatric ward 6 months later. He couldn't stop trying to sew his own mouth shut. I retired. I moved to New York, as far from the natural world as I could get. People ask me why I drive a cab in the city. They say the traffic is a nightmare, the people are rude, and the air is filthy. I just smile and keep driving. Because in the city, when I look in the rearview mirror, I see faces. Real messy, angry human faces. They might be ugly, but they belong to the people wearing them. But sometimes when I'm driving through a tunnel and the light hits the glass just right, I see a man in a ranger uniform sitting in the back seat. He looks just like Dennis, and he's holding a pair of polished leather dress shoes in his lap. He doesn't say anything. He just points at the meter. And I know, the river of grass is still flowing, and eventually it's going to reach the sea. And when it does, there won't be any faces left at all.